So let me tell you a little story about banking in the village of Pawling, New York and the surrounding townships. And I'm going to tell this story, and I hope everybody can relate to this story from wherever you lived or wherever you grew up, and maybe you can do the same. And so I'm going to tell the story through postal history, through bank checks, through currency, through revenue stamps, through postal cards, postcards, and I'm going to cover the period from about 1849 to 1929. My collection of Pawling goes well earlier than that period and goes well beyond that period. But for the purposes of this story, I thought I would start. This is a sub-collection of one of these areas. And on the front slide, you'll see kind of what I'm going to talk about. And I can tell a story through postcards and through everything else I mentioned. Right there, you'll see the National Bank of Pawling on the left, that old brick building that's been there a long time, and the Pawling Savings Bank just behind it there, that other brick building. These buildings still stand. They were erected a century and a half ago. One of them is still a bank, and the other is now a different sort of shop. But these are there. They have not changed much in all these years. And so I'm going to go through now and give you some of the reasoning behind the story. So let me see if I can advance my slide here. And it's not working. Oh, there we go. So why did I select this topic for research? So my interest in Pawling and Dutchess County started, as I mentioned earlier, when my family and I built a home and moved there from New York City in 2002. And I think everywhere that I've lived, I've always, been interested in the history, and this was no different. I started to research the region's history, and then, of course, lucky for me, a longtime member of the Empire State Postal History Society, Drew Nicholson, lived a couple miles away from me in Pawling, New York. He was the town historian as well, just a great collector and historian, not just of New York State, but other areas. But he happened to live down the block. So I was fortunate in that respect as well, that I had somebody to mentor me through those early days of really trying to learn the history. I started to accumulate and researched the postal history of the era of that period, from the stamp list through stamped, postcards, postal cards, postal stationery, Victorian trade cards, really interesting area, railroad related memorabilia and actual items that traveled on the railroad when the railroad coming out of New York City through the Harlem line came through the town, which also changed the village and the town. Newspapers, hotel related material, just a little bit of everything related to the village and the town and the hamlets and the neighborhoods. A really rich area of history in New York State, let alone, surprisingly, a lot of material that was out there that could be collected. So from that collection, it grew into a sub-collection of then bank checks and promissory notes and bank tags and federal currency, fractional currency, and other ephemera. I think we all have a penchant to all of these other items. Even though, a lot of us collect stamps and covers, it's amazing how much other material we collect to our area of interest. And so the story that I'm going to tell you is going to be a little bit around banking and the village and the town, but it's more than that. And I hope you'll enjoy. So let me dive on in if I can. Here we go. So where is Pawling, New York? For those that want to know on a map where Pawling, and I also collect maps. So a lot of what you're seeing on my original maps that I've tried to scan and put in here, whether it's the map on the left, which shows, Long Island, and my dogs are barking, so apologies, which shows Long Island here in New York City and Manhattan. And about 70 miles north here, and you can see the railroad line up to New York and Harlem, is this little red dot in Dutchess County, which is this county here, which is the little town and the village of Pawling, New York. So here is an exploded view of another map from 1867, shows the various school districts. That's why they're color-coded the way they are. Shows the railroad line coming straight up through the middle. This is a very large ridge called Quaker Hill, which runs all the way up and down the border of Connecticut and New York, and it's a natural divider of the two states. And then here is Pawling. And the town was not always where it was, but when it was here, and then it moved west when the railroad came up and through, and the main street is here, and that's where the bank is and all the activity. And so a beautiful little area, beautiful little town. There's only around 3,000 folks that still are there that live in this little town, like I said, 65 miles north of Manhattan. It's a really nice little enclave. And so we had a really good time living there all those years we lived there. And so here are a few other maps or little copies of maps that sort of break out the town and the village And so this is from 1858, and it's sort of a fanciful drawing from the Gillette map, and it shows the New York Harlem Railroad coming through and the station, and it shows the Bank of Paul. Even back then, 1858, it was the original building for the bank. And so we'll go through some of these other items as we go through, but very simple little main street coming through town. This is called Railroad Street, and the banks are right here at the corner, at the T. So here's a later map of the village and the station. A lot more buildings, a lot more business. This is 1876. The village and the town started to grow. As you see, here's railroad. I just pivoted it now, 90 degrees. Here's the National Bank of Pawling on this 1876 map. Here's a number of other shops. Here is where, in a few years, a very large hotel will go up called the Dutchess Hotel. And for our purposes, the post office is right here in this corner of this building, and it's going to be there for a long time, where a lot of what I'm going to show you was mailed from, was sent to and from. And so we'll talk a little bit about what's going on down here in this little town and village, if the village of Pawling. So I like to also tell stories with postal cards, and as we know, back then in the turn of that last century, 1890s, 1900s, a lot of great postcards were issued of all towns across all of this country, many in black and white. Some were real picture postcards. Others were then also colored. I'm showing you two examples of colored postcards of Railroad Street with the town stationer and sundry shop. And here's that large hotel I was saying, or the Dutcher House as it was called. It is looking north. This is north. And so this is still looks the same way today. One of the few little towns or villages up the Hudson River that still looks exactly the same. Literally has not changed. There's now a nice little old restaurant in here called McKinney and Doyle. The Dutcher House is still here with a few storefronts, but this is essentially exactly how it looks. Except this, you don't usually see this kind of car from 1907 driving around, although you'd be surprised. So I put a yellow circle here because I enlarged this postcard. And what I hope you can see here is this says Post Office, Pawling, New York. So right here in this door, and here's a wagon right out front, and maybe there's mail on it, maybe there's not. But this is really where the post office is, and for the purpose of our story, where a lot of these transactions took place coming in and out. The bank obviously did a lot of business back then, and so clearly they would be sending a lot of mail and receiving a lot of mail through this office here. So I wanted to show you another set of cards before we dive on into some of the postal history and revenue stamps and bank checks and all that good stuff, and just show you again another view. This is now looking east. Here's the railroad tracks coming through. The railroad tracks split the banks. And here's just again looking east, the Brick National Bank of Pawling in the distance right here. Again, still standing. It's just not red brick anymore. I think it's painted white. And you can see right here the same view of the bank from another angle looking down Railroad Street, painted white. And again, here's the Dutcher Hotel. Here's those brick buildings. So just two different views again on postcards. These were used. You turn them over. They were stamped. Pawling, 1907, 1910. This one black and white. I have this in color as well. This also comes in those two where they were tipped. Yeah, so just two nice representations of, again, the town, the village, the dirt roads, the old cars, and just a great old view of this little town, this little village. And I think everybody, no matter where you grew up, can find cards that are the same from wherever you were at. So a little history about the banks of Pawling. So two banks. How this little town, this little village had two banks is behooves me, but this is what we see. The Bank of Pawling was organized 1849 under old state laws. And these are some very famous names like old towns do. The founding fathers of a lot of these old towns and villages usually ended up being the business owners and being the heads of the bank. And no different here. Albert Aiken was the president with Bowdish as a cashier. You'll see these names later on. It was like many banks around the country who were just local banks or little village banks became a national bank. Became the National Bank of Pawling in June 1865 after the Civil War. And we'll see that when we look at some of those bank checks and revenues. Cashiers changed over the years. The officers remained the same. Chase, again, is just the name we'll see. And it became inactive. This bank was in operation for a long time. And the National Bank of Pawling was in operation until, by 1883 when it became inactive. And it was acquired then by another bank in 2016, only a few years ago. The second bank that was in Pawling was the Pawling Savings Bank. Many towns, little villages also had a savings bank separate from their, let's say, national bank. That was chartered and incorporated in 1870, open for deposits in 71. And I won't go through all the names, but, they were a fairly successful bank and fairly well organized and did fairly well. You'll see from just some of the notes, 1880, they had $82,000 in deposits with a surplus. Here are the listings of their offices. This bank also had a run of many, many years, and they then finally closed in June of 2006. There was a lot of consolidation in banking around the country during this period, and they were no different from that and were acquired. And so, this slide deck will be on our website, and you could always go back and revisit it. I list all my references, so anybody that's interested in this or any of your, your studies, you can find these notes. So let's show our first piece of postal history. And so this is a real early piece from around 1850 from the Pawling bank check. Really fortunate that they docketed this when they received it, or at least when they sent it, right? They sent it from Pawling, and here's a nice Pawling CDS, just a really nice strike in red, February 5th, undated. The rate at the time, and this was going to New Milford, Connecticut, literally right over the mountain, right over the Quaker Hill, across the border to Connecticut, and the town right there on Route 7 is New Milford. And it was going to a Thomas Wells. The rate was 5 for this envelope. This is an envelope. I don't have the contents, but guess what was written on it? They wrote Pawling Bank. There was a check for 120, and it says Pawling Bank here. So we have a really nice docketing, and we know where it was coming from and where it was going to. And it definitely contained a bank check for the amount from the bank. It has the receiver's endorsement. So it's just a really nice cover, a piece of postal history. It's in great shape. At the time as well, again, we're not just going to talk about covers and stamps and other. We're going to talk a little bit about fractional currency. And banks at the time issued, and the Bank of Pawling was no different during this Civil War period. You'll see that these are dated here, Pawling, November 1st, 1862. Some fractional currency or obsolete currency. And this says pay the bearer 5 cents in current funds when like checks are presented in sums of $1. And so here are 2 unused types. These are not common. These are not easy to find. They are out there. And it's amazing that these little pieces of paper survive, but they have. And so here are 2 unused, a 5 and a 10. I believe there is a 25 and a 50. I have yet to been able to grab those or find those, or I've seen 1 or 2, I believe, images. They just don't come up often. And then here below is really another piece that was found in an old book I obtained. It was glued inside of a ledger. And it was carefully tried to remove, but you can see the piece of it. Here is another bank we'll talk about, just north of Pawling, it's in Amenia, New York, another 20 miles north of Pawling. And the name of the man that founded this bank and collection office was Hiram Vail. And he issued his own little notes, but they were payable on the Bank of Pawling. And so pay the bearer 25 cents in current funds when the like, $1. He signed it. This was used. He numbered each one of them. This is a 25 center. There's a 5. There's a 10, a 25, a 50. Very rare note. They're out there. There's nothing printed on the back of all of these, just blank backs. You could see a nice little image here. It looks like a farm scene, hay, bales, a plow, a field. Very agrarian in this part of the world. It was very agricultural and a very large producer of milk, which was transported down Old Drovers Road straight down to New York City, to Westchester, New York City. And a lot of, just like this part of the world here in Lancaster County, was the breadbasket, which fed a lot of Philly. This part of the world also fed a lot of New York City, and the boroughs. And so there's a lot of business and transactions going on at this time, this part of the world, up and down the Hudson. So I alluded to Hiram Vail on this slide, and this was the first fractional currency or currency he put together in October 62. what you'll see on the next few slides is he clearly got a better printer. We believe from my research that he made these in the town of Amenia, and he probably made these himself. But very soon thereafter, and look at this beautiful note, he went down to New York City and he hired a stationer, professional stationer, called Snyder, Black and Stern in William Street, New York City, to create these beautiful fractional currencies, which are backed by the Bank of Pawling. Beautiful scenes. I've highlighted those. Here's a train in the lower right corner. This is, again, a 5-cent note. He signed this one. This one's used. He numbered them all. I think I have 10 examples of these 5-centers. I listed the numbers here. I even have one that's unused, unsigned. They are in all sorts of different condition, from really being used to like mint condition or barely used. They're just very pretty notes. Again, there's nothing on the back. These are plain, but it's a nice note. And I'll quickly go through some of the others. How about a 10-cent note? This is a beautiful note again, 10 cent. Hiram Vail signed it, payable on the Bank of Pawling. You could see the date. Every one of them is dated Amenia, New York, November 1st, 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War here. They were payable at the bank if you brought in this 10-cent note. This has another nice image here of horses, and they're drinking down at the lower right. Again, I've got about 8 examples, I think, now of these notes. Again, all different condition. This is, again, a really nice note. Again, numbered them. Here is a 25-cent. Again, not very common, very few out there, rarely see them come up. You could see some of the staining around this. This was also glued onto a really odd piece of paper, and it was very acidic. And so, I like to preserve all of these artifacts to make sure that they can last for the next generation of folks. So I carefully removed it and got the glue off the back, which was not good for this, and cleaned it up a bit, flattened it out, and now it's preserved. And so again, another nice note, signed and numbered. And then finally, the highest value that he issued was a 50-cent. And so this was a leftover. This was never used. It never saw. He didn't sign it. You've got the 3 dots, control, unsigned, unused. But again, another nice note, 50-cent fractional currency with, again, another nice image here, an allegorical figure. You'll see the shield and a number of other images in front. And so that's fractional currency related to the Bank of Pawling through this very well-known and well-to-do Hiram Vail, who was the president of the bank. He was a postmaster for many years. He did a lot of things up in the town of Amenia. And if you're interested, at the end, I published a paper on just this particular person, Hiram Vail. And now this stuff all resides in the society. The Amenia Historical Society has a copy of a lot of this in the paper and the publications for their history. So let's keep going, because I want to keep showing you some more here. For those that might not know how these notes are printed, and again, another very rare piece, an uncut sheet as printed by Snyder, Black and Stern, which they issued to Hiram Vail. This is how they created their fractional currency. Most currency back then was printed similarly in larger sheets, usually with more of the lower denomination and then a few of the higher denomination. So this is just a great sheet. It survived. It is preserved. It's got a file fold here where this came out of the file fold, but it's just a great piece for those that are looking to collect these areas. You could find these for your town, village area. They do exist out there. It's just a really nice piece of history. So now let's move to fractional currency, and soon I'm going to get to revenues and bank checks and all sorts of other goodies. But, at the period, 1860s, currency was issued from the United States, bonded, secure here with the Treasury down in Washington, and Pawling was no different than any other bank where they issued their own currency. Here is a very rare note, a $5 note. You'll see the red serial numbers. You'll see the charter. So all banks received their charter number and were issued a permanent number that stayed with them for the life of the bank. Pawling's number, their charter number, was 1269. So if you ever see a 1269 on even a check or on currency, and you'll see more currency, 1269 is them. And I mentioned earlier some of the folks that ran the bank. And so the cashier was Chase. You see Chase signed it, and the president of the bank was Aiken. He didn't just run the village and the town and own a lot of property. He was also the head of the bank, as is wont. I think even he was postmaster for a short amount of time in addition. So a lot of folks back then wore a lot of hats. This is from July 1865. It is written counterfeit in pen across the front, but I can tell you why somebody added that. I couldn't tell you. This is not a counterfeit bill. It is not. It's been authenticated and it is true, and it's got all that, the bells and whistles with it. Really nice note, and it seemed that very few are out there, as you might imagine. They didn't issue a lot. Let's show you another really cool note, 1885, another $5 note. Really pretty note, front and back. You'll see again 1269. That is the charter number. $5 note. You'll see the signatures here below. 1269 on the back. Beautiful engraving. Scroll work here. Scenes at the left and the right. The eagle. Just a very pretty note. The serial numbers in blue. Again, just don't see these often, but when you do, I'm just happy to have one, and then at some point it finds a new home with somebody else for them to enjoy it. The engravings here, we all like engravings, and just beautifully done on currency, just like done on stamps. Here's another one of my favorite. This is probably the first one I ever acquired many years ago when I first moved up there. I guess back in 2002 or 3, maybe 4. Is this $5 note from 1905. These are larger bills. These are a little bit larger than the currency that we're used to, as everybody's aware back then. You had a wad of these folded in your pocket. It was a nice large billfold, no doubt. This was issued, again, 1905, National Bank. You'll see in blue now the 1269E, the serial number here at the upper right and lower left. You can see faded. This is signed. There are signatures, and they're just faded, but they are here. This says Tabor, T-A-B-E-R, another famous name up in Pawling. In that part of the world, there's roads and streets and alleys named, and they also, owned a lot of business at that time. And here's a nice little, picture of Benjamin Harrison. Really nice engraving again. Again, just all the work around it. I think I have the next one to show the back of this as well. Yeah, and again, a great scene. This note was used, and you can see a nice scene here. This is the landing of the Pilgrims. And so very, we only just had that story not too long ago here, and thank you, David, for presenting that. But you'll see a depiction here of the landing of the Pilgrims on the back of the note, and I just blew up some of the work here and the engraving and the seal. We look at notes every day. We carry them in our pocket for those that do. I know we're in this digital age, but I think just currency is beautiful in its own right. And so I always like to share currency where I can. And so now I want to start to move into some of the revenue stamps, some of the bank checks, what was related at the time. I like engravings. And so here is a beautiful picture and an engraving of now, Federal Hall, the Customs House, downtown, on Wall Street, New York City, looking east from the corner of Broad, which is, eventually Broadway. There were a lot of famous, and well-known stationers and producers of just phenomenal work. And of course, the banks, took advantage of this where they could to print a lot of their stationery and their bank checks and their fractional currency. And Pawling was no different. And there were even some, like our banks here in Pennsylvania, they usually leaned on the Philadelphia stationers. The same was in New York. And so I'll go through some checks and just show you a little bit of, again, here's revenue stamp. At the time, there was a fee, and it was a 2-cent fee, and you had to pay that, and this was how, the government was generating revenue, to take care of the effort which was going on. This is knee-deep in the Civil War here, 1863, a very simple check. But it was made by Burnett Stationer, 61 Wall Street, that same group I just showed you before. A little bit of scroll work here on the left, 2-cent bank check. Here is Duncan Campbell. We'll talk a little bit about Duncan Campbell later. But he signed this check, and as you go through checks, you can see this is not a small amount. It's a $400 check in 1863. Pretty large amount of dollars back then. It's got a nice R5C revenue, 2-cent bank check. And Duncan, as was the case, they didn't use really a stamp that often, a canceling device. They usually use their initials. This is DC, and they usually dated it. So I'll show you some other checks and how these evolved. Here's just another one, 1864, the next year, very similar, very plain. The checks were cut and canceled. You'll see these usually cut here and canceled once they went through. This was Duncan Campbell writing a check to himself, right? So he wrote a check to himself, clearly was, taking money out, moving things around. Now you've got another check. And so this is interesting because you remember I brought up Amenia early and I showed you some fractional currency. So here is a check of Pawling from the Bank of Pawling, where Pawling was crossed out but was used in Amenia, New York, because they were leveraging that little collection division up there by Hiram Vail, and they were leveraging the Bank of Pawling, and they were paid under the Bank of Pawling. And so here's a nice check again with the revenue. It's to the order of Nelson Miller. This is for $129. And you'll see another C that's here. So there's a blue hand stamp C, just again denoting that this was not within Pawling but outside at the other bank. And it's signed. I always like to point this out when you're looking at checks. You always want to see who it's made to, and you want to see who signed it. And so for the postal historians in the room, this is signed by Milo Winchester. He served for 60 years as the South Amenia postmaster, which is the 6th longest in post office history. There were individuals across this country that once they had that postmaster position, they had it for life. And Milo was one of those who was in that role. Probably, I think my research, he was probably 90 when he passed on. So he had a pretty good dang run as postmaster, as well as overseeing a number of different endeavors. So here's a nice little check. Here's a second one that I found as well that was used in Amenia. That again was made out the same for a higher amount. It has the same C. Milo signed it. In this case, I'm showing the back because back then, all of the different transactions were all tracked. And so you can see this was, pay for the Troy Bank, and then you can see Quasaic Bank. So again, just a little bit of history, front and back. You never know what you're going to see or find. And again, we've got a check and we've got a revenue stamp on it. And here's another final one. This was, I think, a recent find again. Again, don't come up that often, but when you're looking through a box, you'll be surprised what you find. And if you have a town or an area you collect, this might supplement one of your collections for covers or stamps or checks. And, if you like revenues, it's nice to get the revenue actually on a check when it's doing its thing. And in this case, the revenue check, the revenue stamp paid the 2 cents. And look, it's one of our friends, Vail. So again, Hiram Vail up in Amenia was a very popular name, and that family really oversaw that town. So now, an interesting check here that it took me a while to even notice this when I first acquired it, was this from 1867. And remember, banks at this time period became national banks, and Pawling was no different, but they did not have time to print new checks that said National Bank of Pawling. So what did Duncan Campbell do? He got a hand stamp. And he used the hand stamp in red, and he just stamped it national. So at this period, they were a national bank, and he was waiting probably for his stationer delivered new checks. But in the meantime, he had to use them, and he was a national bank. And again, a 2-cent revenue, taking care of the fiat. This is a $525 check, which is a pretty tidy sum of money back then. Probably an interbank check. Again, it's made out to self. It's made out to Duncan. So now we're going to go through the evolution of checks.
Charles?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is Bob Karate. I just wanted to point out, I see that check signed by Duncan Campbell. Just might be interested in knowing that the exact spelling of his name, Duncan Campbell. He is currently the president of the Pennsylvania Bankers Association.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
Duncan is spelled exactly the same way. I talk to him periodically. Yep.
Really? That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I did not know that.
Located in Harrisburg. Yep.
Yeah, we'll have to talk after this as well. So this Duncan Campbell is from obviously this part of the world, and was also the founder of a little town or a little hamlet, call it what you want, in Pawling, just north of the village of Pawling, called Campbellsville. So Duncan Campbell helped to start a little town called Campbellsville, and then eventually became the head there of the bank for a while. So thank you for sharing that tidbit of information. I did not know that. Let's keep going. Let's now go to the period a little bit later here where, and I show a nice little building here. This is another company called Corliss, Macy & Co. They are stationers and printer down on Nassau Street. And we also recently heard about Nassau Street, I think only a couple weeks ago. So this was not too far from our friends on Nassau Street that were selling stamps and things. There were some stationers and printers down there as well. One, they were at Pearl, and then they moved around. But, they were stationers. They did blank books, printers, they were lithographers, importers, domestic stationery, writing papers, just a slew of materials. Here is a nice little piece that I have from them. And again, I have another little book here, Checks and Draft, Corliss Macy, just a nice little cover sheet here of this group. Now the Bank of Pawling and many other banks during this period in the late 1860s started to really elevate because it was part of, I think, their advertising as well, started to put together a completely different type of bank check. And I think if you look at these bank checks, you will agree, this is not this bank check. This is a whole different type of bank check where different type of engraving and subject matter. They now are the National Bank of Pawling. And this is, again, 1869. I've got two back-to-back here, only a few weeks apart, if you will, September 25th, December 20th. These are now printed by Corliss, Macy & Co., and they would print a lot of checks for not just Pawling, but a lot of banks. So you'll see a lot of common themes. You will see, again, the revenue stamp that's used here in the upper right. You'll see that this actually has a box that has been, that's in the printed check so that it helps the individual put the stamp there in the right spot. Also interesting, you're seeing they're not just signing them now, but the bank had a circular date stamp made, if you will, which says Bank of Pawling on it, and they actually canceled and tied this revenue to this check. And so you'll start to see an evolution. Here's some really nice, this is a nice Patriot with a rifle and a flag in red, again, signed by Duncan Campbell. So just really nice subject matter on a nice check. And let's keep going. Here we have one as well that's in violet. So they didn't just print one color. They printed multiple colors. No doubt, here's the next year. This is March, at least of 1870, but you'll see the date says 60, and they crossed it out, probably waiting for their new checks to be written or printed with the new decade. This was a carryover from the 1860s, but they're in March 1870. Here's a revenue stamp, Duncan, and he's this is to Stark, another large landowner up in that part of the world, who ran a large farm and was very well known in this country for raising bees and selling bees and queen bees to a lot of the farmers, and would pack them up and mail them around. And so that's a whole different subject I can tell you about. But mailing bees around the country is a great separate topic for discussion because people did mail bees, and they still do. So now let's go to another check here, 1870. Now they removed the 6 or the 7. They just left it blank, gives them a little more flexibility. This was used on March 7, National Bank of Pawling. You'll see they changed. It's still the same stationer, but they changed designs and they changed the subject matter. So here's a farmer with the scythe in red, and they moved the location where the stamp goes there. And here's another example in violet, 1870. And they're not done changing the subject matter. So here's another one, 1870. Interesting thing here, again, these are 3 days apart. These are probably came out of, probably near the same sheet, because they were printed in, I think, sheets of 3 or 4 of these checks, and they would then be sliced as needed. And so these are definitely within the same. Now let's evolve again. Let's show you that Patriot with the rifle and flag. I think you remember him from earlier. They also printed these in blue, not just red. This also has 1860 crossed out. It's in 1870. And even the cancellations are evolving. This is a very typical herringbone cancel that almost cuts through the stamp design, and it attaches the stamp. Then it helps to adhere it and prevents reuse to the actual check. And it's got a nice blue 1870 cancel there. And so you'll see that become more common as you evolve here in the 1870s, 1880s. Here again, 2 more. One's on a little bit, I guess, orange old paper. This one is now in deep blue. The stamp as well are a little bit different. These are, again, 2 cents. But one is an orange paper with silk. The other is on old paper. So whatever revenues they had at hand, they were using them all the time on every check to pay a fee. Let's not forget green. We like money green. They are a bank. I'm surprised they didn't use green to begin with. But here's a nice check again from 1870s, again with the same farmer holding a scythe. And again, a really nice strike of a U.S. 2-cent revenue with a December 1870 herringbone there. and they're not done changing. I also just show, and I'm going to break for a second, from the Pawling National Bank to go to other banks that were in this part of the world, and this is Pine Plains and Dutchess County a bit north, that also sent checks through the bank or that were endorsed by. And so 18 is that endorsement. Whenever I see a check that says 18 on the front, if I turn it over, I know that it went through Pawling. And when I saw this in the 18 and I turned it over, it says it went through collection of account National Bank of Pawling and was signed. And so again, a little offshoot of this. But why I show it is because, here is revenue stamped paper in the back of your Scott catalog. These are bank checks that were printed on revenue stamped paper, and they have a section in our catalog. And this happens to be RNB1. It's a beautiful 2-cent eagle, yellow orange, and you'll see revenue stamped paper also associated with bank checks. They weren't just using the stamps, they were using revenue stamped paper. And so here's the second one that I found from Stissing that was then also used. I saw the 18, I turned it over, I knew it had to go through Pawling, and it did. And again, here is a completely different, beautiful, large RNC1, Washington in the center in orange, 2 cents. Just a great vignette here. That's revenue stamp paper from Stissing National Bank that went through Pawling. So let's keep going. They switched to another printer. I thought that they were doing a pretty good job, Corley's, but for a short amount of time, the Bank of Pawling went with another firm, Vidal and Brown. Here is that building downtown on Broad Street still there, and here's an advertisement I found of them that was in the internal record of all of what they do. But so they changed, and they went to a Lady Liberty with a flag and a pedestal and a shield in red. Again, this is 1871. Again, the Pawling National Bank. They went in purple as well, or violet, again with the same. Interesting that, again, Vidal is here for a short amount of time. Interesting for me to point out on these two checks, and I acquired them at different times many years apart, is that these checks were once attached and can be reunited. They were absolutely on the same sheet of the same page, used on the same day, two different transactions, but they were sliced right here. And if you put them together, they were once actually together. So that was really cool, I thought, to reunite these two checks after all those years. No doubt these stamps were probably a pair at one time that were separated and placed separately on these two checks for these two different transactions. And now the checks start to get as fanciful as we saw earlier, and now you're getting back to checks that are a little bit smaller, that are a little bit more what we would think of checks nowadays. Everybody's seen checks for the most part here over the past years. And they evolved again, and they went back to Corley's Macy & Co. So they're not being as ornate. They're kind of getting away from that to what we would say would be more of a traditional check, still paying using the 2-cent revenue. Beautiful lathe work here, New York here on the right and on the left in orange. But you can see the continued evolution. And so that's it for the checks and revenues and revenue stamp paper. I just wanted to share with you again, you can broaden your collecting area of whatever area you collect by sort of adding these pieces to it. I think it makes a really nice supplement to the story. But let's bring it back to mail that is related to the bank that went through our postal stream. Banks did a lot of business. They mailed a lot of information out, and they received a lot of information out. And the banks, believe it or not, while they used envelopes and mailed letters with contents, they did a lot with postcards. And so here is one from Pawling, New York. It is pre-printed on the back, National Bank of Pawling, Pawling, New York, 1874. Sir, your favor of these dates, July 23rd, 24th, 25th, is received at the closing. Here's our friend, the cashier, George Chase. This went to me up in Newburgh, New York, which is actually due west on the Hudson River there, Newburgh Beacon. But this is a nice little card, a UX3. It's a 1-cent Liberty Brown. It's got the small USPOD watermark when you hold it up to light. And again, it's just something that they did a lot of, so they're out there. And usually these got filed. There's a terrible strike of Pawling, but it is Pawling. Just wasn't hit well. There is a little cork here as well, and it's at an angle, but it is definitely July. It looks like the 28. You can see the 28. They would be New York here. I can show you more cancellation devices later as we go through this. Coming back to a check for a minute, again, you'll see Pawling then went from just the manuscript, because you're signing a lot of checks. You want this individual to continue to write their initials over and over again. Clearly, they found a better way, and what they did was they created a nice circular stamp here, which says National Bank of Pawling, New York. They could change the date slug out. It just made it a lot easier to continue to do this because they still had to put the 2-cent stamp on. Here's a nice little revenue, orange on green paper. You can really see the green paper there. It used to be on plain old paper, white or silk, and then they went to green. And then finally here, we're getting almost to the end of the checks. You'll see the evolution of the revenue. Here's another check similar, but again with the 2-cent revenue, 152. Again, using that canceling device. This is from 1878. And then finally, the era of more ornate checks is done. And this check from 80 almost looks like the check I showed you back in 1864, which was that simple plain check, kind of utilitarian, just to do the business of the day. And so again, it's got the 2-cent stamp. It's canceled. It's tied. It's 1880. It's signed by Tabor. At least it's made out to Tabor. You'll remember that name earlier from the currency. He signed it from the National Bank. And again, $168, not a small amount on order. And I'm going to move from these to now a little bit more postal history. And so, of course, again, the bank sent mail. This is a nice piece. Now you have corner cards pre-printed with we don't know what stationer they used, but I have a feeling it was the same stationer. Or they used one that was, local to the village or town. But they printed these, no doubt, by the thousands. And here is a nice one of the National Bank of Pawling, New York, if not called 4 and 5 days. Here's a much better strike of a typical, simple Pawling, New York canceling device with a target cancel here, tying a nice little banknote. There are no contents. We know the date. Nice that when Titus from Wing Station or Wingdale, which is the next town north of Pawling, up the railroad, put his little mark on it when he received it, which was great, 1878. Postal historians love when the receivers docketed their covers, so we kind of can put it in its right context. And this is one of those covers. Here is another one. So now the town of Pawling, or the postmaster in Pawling, helped us out a lot because he evolved his canceling device by putting the year. So isn't that nice when the post office and the postmaster and clerks put the date in their CDS? So you could see, again, same stationery, or if you will, same envelope, printed up. This time, again, another nice banknote with the CDS. It's a new one. It's double circle. It's got a comma after Pawling, and it's got month, date, year with a nice New York. Really good strike. And again, on the back, this is just a cover front. There is no envelope. It's removed. It was cut. There are holes in here. This was used, whatever the contents were, was written on the back, BD. Sarah M. Fowkes, February 27th, it looks like. I don't think it's December. I think it's February, not December. 27 at 100. So this was probably put on file of what was in here. This is National Bank, National Ulster Bank, County Bank in Kingston. So again, a nice little piece of history. It's a front from the bank with the stamp, CDS, tying, and docketing. And we'll go on. So they still utilize printing. Now we're evolving with our covers and our stamps. And look at our cancel. So Pawling, like many others in the 1880s, started to get a little bit more ornate with their canceling devices. They've kept Pawling in New York. They added these little, half crescents above and below. Now they're using a straight line date here with the year. And again, another target killer on the stamp. And it's a nice little 2-center. This is going to Weebatuck. Again, north on the railroad, just up north, a couple of towns up north, up Route 22. Again, no contents. Every once in a while you get contents, but very rarely. Let me share something else that, if you want to collect something, you might call it ephemera, is a share certificate. So the banks issued share certificates. This one is a really nice unused one, a specimen. Not that common, but they are out there with the left tab detached with a really nice engraving. And for those in the room, this is the American Banknote Company, New York. So we know about the American Banknote Company from this era and all the printing that they did for printing stamps for us and all sorts of other goodies. And this is from that period of 1905 to 1920. Just again, another nice piece. There is writing on the back describing, all the details. You can probably see it coming through this image here. But again, it's be it known that the proprietor of gets X amount of shares in capital stock in the National Bank of Pawling, Dutchess County. Just a really nice piece to go along with this story. A nice engraving, nice images and vignettes, again, printed by the American Banknote Company. We know about that. So let's keep going with mail. So there's definitely more mail that was printed and, that was sent. And these are more pre-printed postcards a little bit later. It's really nice cards, a UX20, one set McKinley, pre-printed again on the back, the National Bank of Pawling. Again, doing a lot of mail back and forth. Your favor of today. They mailed it. He probably got something. He immediately received it, and he got out a stack of postcards, signed it, and dropped it in the mail. Probably had one of their kids run up the block to the post office, which was literally a couple hundred yards away from the banks, and they could drop this in probably, at the end of the day. You could see where this did go through the end of the day, because by now the Pawling CDS has evolved with a mute killer here, and you see 6 p.m. So we know it went in at 6 p.m. And now you see Wing's Station was renamed Wingdale. It was after the family Wing, the Wing farm and the Wing family. And so again, Titus doing some business back and forth, and you'll see another card here. Let's go on another couple years. So here's another one again, just for collecting postcards. Very nice. It's a nice UX24 with McKinley. It's red, but in this case, again, it's pre-printed on the back from the National Bank of Pawling. It's got a really nice CDS with killer here, and it again went up to Wingdale from George Chase, our cashier at the bank. They also did use postal stationery. So we would be remiss if we didn't include some postal stationery. Again, I'm surprised that these artifacts survived from all of the different areas, whether it's a regular old cover, if you will, with the stamp on it, whether it's a postcard, or in this case, it is postal stationery. Here is a U413, a really nice 2-cent Washington die one. It's not your typical white cover. It's an Oriental buff. And again, here they're using their return address as well. It is a full envelope, no contents, ripped open at the top, but it was going to another cashier again, Charles Snyder up in Kingston. And again, it has a really nice CDS and a nice neat cancel. Just a very pretty cover in general. And for my study, it ties back to the bank. So what I thought I would show and just take a little breather here is that from all, not just this study, but from all of my other studies of Pawling and the towns and other letters coming and going, I was able to, and I always like when you can do this because it really hasn't been done before, but when you collect postal history, you have the ability to do that, is to kind of put a postmark timeline together, which I think is really neat. And so obviously, like many post offices before, they had an official date stamp, a hand stamp, a rubber stamp, a metal stamp, whatever stamp. The markings were done by manuscript. And Pawling was no different. And Pawling was not always Pawling. Pawling went through a couple of iterations and a couple of different spellings. And in this case, the one at the upper left was Pawlingsville. And they used to spell Pawling, P-A-U-L-I-N-G. They used to also spell it Pawlings. And so if you look in, at the history of these towns and villages, and I'm sure the ones that you collect, you would see that a lot of times they went through some name changes and permutations. But then eventually they landed on the name, and the USPOD sort of fixed that in. But it was Pawlingsville, and there's maybe a few of those are known, Pawlingsville from the late 1820s, 30s. And then in about the 1840s, mid-1840s, a canceling device came out. For me, it's not 1847. I know I've mapped this. And Pawling really didn't get that red canceling device, I think, until 1853, 54, so I should probably update this slide. They were really using manuscript markings prior to that. And they went from red to black in 1855, like was needed and required here. Red became a no-no for most parts, and a lot went to red. And in this case, they had their central AU. And then in this particular case, the slug, the day was put at an angle, the right angle, and no year. And you'll see just the evolution of the postmarks over the years. Here's the larger one, big letters, serif, 1858 to 61. It went then to this really tiny, small, black, rough looking, it almost looks handmade. Interestingly, the 10 is inverted, the 1 is inverted. And then you can see the evolution of the markings. I showed you a few of these earlier. They got a little bit clearer here, and they put New York a little bit larger. They then went to the double circle and added the year. Again, you'll see the evolution. And then finally, eventually, 1880s, 1890s, into the teens, even into 1940s, all of these markings should look familiar, and they really become quite standard across the whole country with respect to requirement of these standard markings. I throw this marking here in the middle, which is something we'll talk about because I mentioned earlier, like all of the towns that you lived in and grew in and studied, the railroad came through town, and mail was accepted via the route agent in the town that was on the train. And route agents had their own canceling device when they received mail at the train going north up towards Albany, if you will, or the train stopping at Pawling and going south towards New York City and stopping at every town along the way. And here is, again, a not common railroad marking or route agent marking of the Pawling and New York agent that was at the Pawling train station, that any mail that has this, you know, was put on board that train. That route agent canceled it, and it was transported in a mail bag on its way to its final destination. So another little area for those collectors out there that like to, you know, maybe add a little railroad to your collecting area. I find this, again, intriguing, and that's why I show it. And I've got a number of different covers that have the railroad marking on it from Pawling north of Pawling, going way up north towards the Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut border at Four Corners, if you will, and then mail that went on the train that went down to Westchester County and into New York City. But let's get back to other areas of collecting around banks and stamps. And here are some National Bank of Pawling bank tags that were utilized on very large sums of money that were moved between the bank and the Federal Reserve. Quite a bit of cash was moved, and they were sent registered. And you can see it here on the front, National Bank of Pawling, Pawling, New York. This is from 1963, registered with the number there as well. And they had to pay the fee of $3, and they used Scott number 1051, Susan B. Anthony, canceled by a target killer. And again, it survived. And so this is, this very thick cloth. That's what these bank tags are made out of. The stamps a lot of times don't stay on, but they're fairly good glue, and they stayed on pretty well. And this paid that fee for $3 million. I believe that's what my research shows was in the mail bag that was moved was $3 million, and the fee was $3. Here are two more, and I look long and hard to find these, and every once in a while you see them. And so here again is a 1957. And again, if somebody wants to give me more info on this, I'm all ears. I think the research and my research has kind of shown what was in these, but here's a little bit later. 1957, registered 86, the Bank of Pawling to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, downtown. And so here on the back is $7.19, covering a $20 million transfer. And here's another one from 63 with this number, again, from Pawling, New York. So this is U.S. Post Office, so they specifically, again, were canceling. And this has $3.65 on the reverse. So just, again, a nice little sub-area of collecting, again, with stamps and the bank and bank tags that absolutely serve the purpose. And, of course, if you're interested, you could also, with the stamps that are on here, you can look for variations. Because, here some of these might fluoresce because they issued these tagged or untagged at the time. And depending on what stamps are on here, you might find perforation varieties and all that good stuff. So just another area that you can research. Oh, and I just wanted to point out, here's 20M, 20 million, 3M, 3 million. This covered the registration for that amount in these bags to get that money to the Federal Reserve, just so we know where that data is coming from. I'm coming back to currency. I'm coming back to money that looks familiar to us. So everybody's seen a $10 bill, and this just happens to be a National Bank of Pawling $10 bill, national currency from 1929. You can see that here, 1929 series. You'll see the 1269, which is denoting the charter. It is in brown with the brown seal. Really nice note. Here's 1269 in black. Again, these come up often, not a lot, but they're out there. Low serial number, 1927 with the A. So just again, another really nice note. I'm happy to find them in any condition and then preserve these for future collectors. Here's a $20 note, 1929, same series, even lower serial number, 19, very low, 29, Jackson in the middle. Again, it's kind of a reddish seal. It's a little bit washed out here, but again, really nice note. I'm coming to the end, everybody. I appreciate your patience while we're looking here as we ended the Bank of Pawling. Here is a picture. The building still stands. I mentioned it earlier. I got to tell you, I even think this light post might still be there here in 2020. This is, again, a real picture postcard from this era, circa 1920s. It still stands. It is another bank. There's actually the train station literally comes right here every day, a number of times a day. And across from that train station is the other bank and the other building. And so I hope what I've showed you today is taking you on a little bit of a journey through part of my collection from the years I lived in Pawling of what you can put together using postcards and currency and postal history and bank checks and fractional currency and revenue stamps and revenue paper and real picture postcards and all of that good stuff to kind of weave a little story here that I hope was interesting to you. And with that, I think that's the last slide it is. I will stop and take questions, and I will stop sharing so we can all see each other. And I'm happy to go back to any slides if anybody is interested.